I demand to see the manager. Have you ever said that? Whenever, as a good consumer, whenever you were not satisfied with your purchase or the kind of treatment you were given as a customer and you had terrible customer service. Because probably the person you were dealing with didn't probably have your best interest in mind, as you think. And so you look for the chain of command, looking for that person that might have your better interest, or the better interest of the business, or the better interest of their career. In a sense, we have in today's gospel a chain of command. Notice what happens. Again, first of all, let me preempt that by reminding you of whose gospel we are hearing from. John. And John is anything but literal. And so everything we hear, we need to understand he writes very symbolically and very metaphorically. And so when those Greeks are asking to see Jesus, they're not necessarily asking for a meeting with Jesus. Notice how it goes. The Greeks ask Philip. Now these Greeks outside, ask Philip, who is possibly a Greek Jew, for a meeting with Jesus. Now notice the theology there. Remember the Samaritan woman when Jesus was engaged in the 4th chapter? And he's reminded that the Samaritans, that salvation comes from the Jews. That's John speaking to us. That's his theology. And so with that chain of command, we start with the Greeks. Then we go to Philip, who was, by the way, using as a Greek name. And then he brings Philip to Andrew, another Greek, of which, again, getting closer and closer to that center where Jesus is. And then from Philip and Andrew, they go to the Jews, who is Jesus. Notice the chain of command happening from out to in. So we have Jesus, who represents, if you want to say, that Jewish center. How does Jesus respond to these Greeks? Or actually the chain of command. He responds by saying, what is it that what are you seeking? In other words, we want to see Jesus, but Jesus says, what you will see is a seed. A seed. Now, we know from being good farmers, right? We're those who planted tomatoes and gardens. This kind of seed, grows into vegetation. Now, we don't use the word death when we put seed into the ground. We use the word germinate, right? When the seed goes into the ground, it germinates into a plant. And from that plant, fruit. And from that fruit, more seed. Right? There's seeds and a lot of seeds in tomatoes. And that cycle keeps going. And this is how Jesus identifies himself, as a seed that goes into the ground, and calls it a form of death. Now, he makes a distinction here, or actually the gospel writer makes a distinction here, using the words of Jesus. Unless a seed by itself is a seed. Translated, those who keep an individual life as a separate life, nothing's going to happen to you. In other words, and in fact, if you are just remain as an individual life, as a separate life, just individual, unconnected life, when you meet death, your death will end up as a form of, for better or worse, termination. But Jesus, in the words of the gospel, is saying, when you meet death, if you disidentify yourself as an individual with a separate life, in other words, I'm connected with others, you're not going to meet death as a termination, but death becomes a transformation. Big difference. Heavy difference. Wow, starting to wrap your head around this. Now here's the kernel, part of the kernel. Hopefully you can grasp this. When we engage in this process, transformation, and make that process known. Wow. And make the process known. We reveal how Jesus identifies and reveals himself in that process, and Jesus becomes present. In other words, Jesus breaks down any chain of command that we have. In this process of transformation, what is manifested is how we become disciples. What is manifested in this process of transformation is the resurrection. What is, again, manifested is death is no longer seen as an extinction, but an exaltation. Head swimming? Yep. And here's the kernel that you will remember. Some crazy spiritual person wrote this. I just remember this. Die before you die, so that when you die, you won't die. Wow. Let me repeat that. Die before you die, so when you die, you won't die. Now that is a seed, hopefully planted in you. Let me throw that out a little bit. You have a choice. Life could be, if you want, a sense of manipulation, a sense of conniving, a sense of getting what you want, a sense of, using someone's word, a group of machinations, so that I will get out of life what I demand and what I want. Or, in that process of transformation, we become receivers that simply, quietly, silently are just present.